but chill. When we start the revolution.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. No, that's okay. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank you kindly. Oh, I don't think I can live up to such an introduction at all. I certainly want to thank you for inviting me here, and I'm certainly honored to be asked to speak with you and share a bit with you this afternoon, and certainly to give honor to the Honorable Marcus Garvey. So I hope I can do him honor in what I have to say here today. I'd like to make a few preliminary statements. You no doubt have gotten the handout here dealing with the series of lectures I will be giving starting on April 17th and from each Friday thereafter for 5 consecutive Fridays. In that series of lectures, I will be talking about the psychology of self-hatred and self-defeat. And I want to go into detail in terms of this kind of psychology because it is so crucial to our current situation. It's so crucial to how we arrived at our current situation. And it is an issue that is the psychology of self-hatred, is an issue that we have to deal with if we are to move forward as a people, because that psychology is so intimately related to everything that we do. So some of you heard some introductory statements about it on LIB radio, and some of you perhaps heard the show on National Black Network. I'm taking the opportunity in this series of lectures to be able to talk uninterrupted by the phones and to sort of give a coherent presentation of this psychology, which I think is very, very important for us to know. We will talk a good deal about how that psychology, as you can see in the first portion here, our first 2 lectures will deal essentially with the introjection of self-hatred into the oppressed African personality. Just how does this psychology of self-hatred work, and how was it induced into the African mind, and how does it operate in the African psyche? What are the particular techniques that were used by our oppressors to bring about this psychology? So we will talk about it in technical detail. The lectures will be somewhat didactic in the sense that we really want to discuss thoroughly the psychology of the inducement of self-hatred so that we can get into some form of self-understanding. And of course, so that once we learn the techniques, we can arrive at methods for overcoming the psychology as such. I'd also, of course, like to take this opportunity to sort of plug my business over there, 215 West 125th Street, the Harlem Graphic Arts Center, which some of you, of course, are familiar with. You've come by to see us over there. I'd like to invite the rest of you there, and of course your friends, to come by, because as I've indicated on a number of occasions, we are trying to put into concrete action the ideology and the philosophy of such great leaders as Marcus Garvey, and to show that black nationalism is not just an ideology, and it's not just a rhetoric, but that it is an ideology that leads to self-actualization and concrete development. We want to show then that what we are about philosophically and ideologically shows itself in concrete construction and development. We are over there trying to overthrow a number of myths, the myths that we as people cannot work together and build an enterprise that is efficient, the myth or the mythology of the so-called black business person. We're trying to establish an efficient organization there, one that provides full services. We are trying to also destroy the myth that one has to deny his or her culture in order to so-called make money or to create wealth. You often hear many of our people talking about they're not about black power but green power, as if those two things can be really separated. The route to green power, or whatever monetary color you want to talk about, is through black power. And consequently, you will see there are efforts to try to meld wealth creation, job creation with cultural advancement and development. And we will not hide our culture, we are projecting our culture. We recognize that European culture has been projected not through lectures, but through commercial activities, through trade, through economic development. The European cultural imperialism is the handmaiden of European economic and militaristic imperialism. And ultimately then, if we are to advance the culture, we must advance the culture at all levels of our activities, which includes our commercial activities as well. It is very important that we succeed over there, because we want to illustrate that when an African votes and moves in favor of an African ideology, he's not voting for poverty, he's voting for enrichment. He's not voting for dependency. He's not voting for an empty rhetoric and an empty rage, but is voting to do something concretely about his situation. Our success as a business is one of the greatest political statements we can make. And we urge you then to help us make that statement along with other sisters and brothers who are here in Brooklyn, who are, of course, in the other boroughs in Manhattan, who are trying to do the same thing. We talk with each other, we work with each other, and we collaborate with each other in an effort to try to advance the ideology of African nationalism. So we all need your support. I want to look for a moment at what I would call the legacy of Marcus Garvey. I want to note personally that it was the reading of the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey that did so much to transform my own attitudes about myself and about, of course, my people. Not that I needed to be transformed from an assimilationist or integrationist, self-hating position, but into a coherent position, into a coherent ideological position. I was fortunate in my own upbringing to have been reared in a black community and to have been educated in black institutions where loving black people and being concerned about the advancement of African people was just natural. It was something that did not have to be lectured into be or taught into be. It was just a natural part of my growth and development. However, I must say it was the coming to New York City, making myself reading the books about Garvey and others, exposing myself, of course, to the bookstores there, Michelle's bookstores, standing on the corner there with Davis, who passed here recently, and hearing other speakers that sort of put it all in place for me, sort of gave me my ultimate sense of direction. On my shelf right now is a 4-act play about Marcus Garvey. I have one more act to go, written about 10 or 15 years ago, as a matter of fact. So it's been sitting there. And of course, I've been telling myself I'm going to ultimately get around to finishing that play. So you can see that my relationship with him, my spiritual relationship with him, has been quite intimate. Intimate enough for me to, in my first writing efforts, to seek to dramatize his life and represent his life and his philosophy in such a way that it could advance my own development and advance the growth and development of my people. And he has been the center of my life ever since. And certainly I see myself as a descendant of Marcus Garvey and what Marcus Garvey was about. Certainly we don't have time today to review the history of Marcus Garvey, and at this point I must frankly say I haven't been up as much as I should have in terms of the reading about that history. So rather than to try to recap this history, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with anyway, I'll just take a brief look at some things I think that Marcus Garvey left us as an individual, as an organizational person, and as a leader of black people. I think one of the major things, of course, in the Marcus Garvey legacy was that of his perception of reality. I often talk about reality in my classes and in my general lectures because we have to recognize that at the center of one's adjustment to the world, at the center of one's ability to deal with the world, to change the world, to suit one's advantage, is a knowledge of reality. The very essence of pathology, the very essence of political, ideological, economic, social, and psychological pathology is a lack of knowledge of reality. How can you deal with reality if you don't know what it is? How can you deal with reality if you're blind to it or if it is distorted? I stated in another context last week that it's somewhat interesting that the brain is locked up in the darkness of the skull, and yet the brain is the central unit that guides our behavior. And it guides that behavior based upon the information it receives from our senses. And therefore our senses must relay to the brain an accurate knowledge of reality, because this is the only knowledge ultimately that the brain gets from the outside world. And the brain, using its innate capacities, its reasoning capacities, its comparative capacities, its basic knowledge and its memory and experience, uses the information given to it by the senses to determine how the person is going to deal with reality and cope with reality, how the individual is going to shape reality to his own purposes. And therefore, if that information is distorted, then the brain determines behavior on that distorted information and the individual is maladjusted. This is the case then with the people. It is necessary for a people, if they are coping with reality, and if they are trying to advance themselves, to know that reality. And they need censors and people who can tell what that reality is, who can inform them as to the nature of that reality, so that the decisions that the group must make in determining how it will behave and how it will shape its destiny can be based on the real and not the unreal. And in Marcus Garvey, then, I see this great censor, this great seer, who informed us of the real world in which we existed. Not of a dream world, not of a world of wishful thinking, not a world distorted by hope, but a world that was seen as it is. A world that was sometimes brutally projected to us as people so that we could use that knowledge to advance our interests as such. And this is a legacy from Garvey that we must continue. Regardless of our pain, regardless of our discouragement, regardless as to what may be going on, we must be determined to look reality in the face and to use that reality as a base and foundation of our behavior. I see also in the legacy of Marcus Garvey of course, the legacy of self-knowledge. Teachers and wise men and women from eons past have indicated that the foundations of sanity and the foundations of wisdom lie on and rest on a knowledge of self, knowing self. And of course, we know the Egyptian philosophy, at the center of that philosophy was the admonition, know thyself. That is the essence of wisdom. Garvey, of course, recognized that a lack of knowledge, that an amnesia about who and what we are is pathological. And we recognize today in psychology that amnesia is a pathological state of mind. And a people who suffer from a lack of knowledge of themselves and of their history, a lack of knowledge of their creation, are a people who suffer then from a loss of identity. We recognize, as Garvey recognized, that this lack of self-knowledge was deliberately induced into the mind and psyche of black people. Because we often state that we could not be Africans and slaves at the same time. We could not hold on to our African identity and our African selves and knowledge of our African culture and be enslaved and be the subordinates of another people. It is only when that knowledge is removed and erased, when that knowledge is degraded and stolen and taken and distorted, it is only then that we lose our identity. And it is then when an identity is placed upon us by another people and by external forces. And therefore, a lack of self-knowledge is a lack of self-awareness. And a lack of self-awareness is an insensitivity to the self. But an insensitivity in the self is also an insensitivity to reality and an insensitivity to the outside world. And without the sensitivity of the outside world and the self, we are left to blindly stumble from one point to another. Ultimately, self-knowledge, in its deepest sense, is a knowledge of others. We cannot really get to know ourselves deeply without ultimately knowing our enemies and without ultimately knowing our friends and without ultimately knowing the Creator in whatever form or fashion. Because to get to know the self ultimately involves moving beyond the self and seeing the world from the vantage point of universalism. Consequently, we see in Marcus Garvey then, in his efforts to rescue us from the pathology of racism, putting a major emphasis on self-knowledge and self-knowing. And we recognize today that if we are to regain our African selves, we must engage deeply in self-knowledge and self-knowing. In psychology, we also recognize that at the center of pathology is the individual's inability to control himself. One of the amazing things about the human mind, when you look at it from the point of view of the so-called unconscious, is that the individual who does not know himself, the individual who does not know reality, the individual who escapes from self-knowledge, is an individual then who does not know the roots and basis of his actions. He is an individual who seems to be determined by external forces or by internal forces of which he has little or no knowledge. He is often constantly puzzled by his own behavior. He's often a wonderment to himself. He struggles against impulses and desires and wishes over which he has little or no control, because he has, in his escape from self-knowing, in his escape from reality, conceded his self-control and given it over to someone else. In releasing his identity and permitting another to place an identity within his psyche, he is at the same time then placed in the hands of that other the ability to control his behavior. So consequently, we see in Marcus Garvey then that if we are to control our destiny, we then must control ourselves. We must enter into a phase where the control of our behavior comes under the domination of our will. The essence in many psychotherapies is to make the individual aware of the unconscious forces, the unconscious wishes and impulses that are determining his behavior against his will. And in making these forces conscious, the individual can bring them under conscious control. The individual can bring his behavior under the dominant control of reason and logic. He then is not a victim of his emotions. He's not swept by emotions and feelings only, but his emotions serve his interests. His emotions are his handmaidens, and he is not the one who's just swept along helter-skelter by feelings and impulses. And we see then in Marcus Garvey the ultimate psychotherapist, the psychotherapist then who is revealing and who revealed the unconscious controls, the controls that were implanted outside of our consciousness by our enemies and by our oppressors. And yet, despite their being outside of our consciousness, they were manipulating our behavior to our own disadvantage. And in bringing those unconscious forces into consciousness, he then made it possible for us to bring those forces under our control and under our rule and under our logic and our rationality and under the control of the ideology of nationalism. And this is a legacy then that still lives today. Often we see in the neurotic individual, in the pathological individual, an individual who has little self-esteem and little self-acceptance. The acceptance of reality, which I referred to at the beginning, ultimately must be the acceptance of oneself. The acceptance of reality, as Marcus Garvey recognized and projected, ultimately must mean the acceptance of our Africanicity, the acceptance of the fact that we are an African people. That seems a bit simple when we state it, and it seems a bit obvious. However, when you engage in psychotherapy, we recognize that sometimes you have the patient who comes into the office who is intellectually aware and can quite often lecture the therapist in terms of theoretical ideas and the theoretical ground for his therapeutic work, but who has not recognized and not confronted himself emotionally, who is not really in his heart accepted what he knows. So what I'm saying here, while we may recognize superficially and intellectually that it is important that we accept the reality of our Africanicity, we must recognize deeply in our hearts, in the very bottoms of our psyches, our Africanicity. To a good extent, a lot of the pathology of the African people today is this vain hope that somehow we will be able to escape our African heritage. That somehow the white man will become colorblind and will not see us for who and what we are. That somehow we will be looked upon as some kind of abstraction, as just a man, not as an African man, not as a black man, but as a man, as a human being only, without culture, without recognition, without identity. And too many of us want to shed our Africanicity for this kind of bogus, abstract existence, which is no existence at all, which is the ultimate acceptance of invisibility. We must recognize that we are an African people and we will be an African people to the end of time, and we must accept all that goes with that. We must accept the goods and the bads and all of the possibilities that goes with being African. We must accept the fact that this white man is never going to accept us totally, and get used to the idea. Hope is a wonderful thing in some senses, but it can be pathological in others. The neurotic individual uses hope in a pathological way. He lives in hope and does not know when to give it up. There's a time that hope has to be given up. When one looks at reality and recognizes reality for what it is, and one accepts certain aspects of that reality and moves on it. The hope that this white man is going to accept you as his own is one of those hopes that you must give up. The hope and the dream that you're going to be holding hands with little white boys and girls, and that the white man is going to feed your children before he feeds his own, that he's going to clothe you before he clothes his own, that he's going to give up his ill-gotten gain and wealth in the name of some kind of bogus brotherhood or classless society is a vain hope. Give it up. Turn it loose. And when you turn it loose, then you will see a growth and development of self. It would mean then an acceptance of self. And we see this then in Marcus Garvey as he got us to accept and tried to get us to accept the reality of ourselves and the reality of our Africanicity. He recognizes, we must recognize again today, that we cannot get self-acceptance through the acceptance of another people. That self-acceptance can only be achieved through the self. We must not wait for our enemies to approve of us and to so-called accept us as a way of accepting ourselves. Because, ladies and gentlemen, our enemies, their very lives, their very way of life depends upon our non-self-acceptance. And if the foundation of their very culture and the foundation of their very economics and social system and political system is one that is founded upon the subordination of black people, then you must recognize that they are not going to give that up. For it would be like giving up their very lives and their very existence itself. And therefore, for us to wait around in the vain hope that through their acceptance we'll come to accept ourselves is to wait for nothing, because we will gain nothing as a result of this kind of illusion. And we see then in Marcus Garvey and in his legacy a confrontation with self-acceptance and what all and all that implies. He helped us to accept ourselves, of course, through a study of our history and in a study of our past. But as I will emphasize a bit later on, we will see that he did not get stuck in history, that he was very much in the present and very much into the future. He recognized, as we must recognize today, ladies and gentlemen, that we cannot advance the interests of our people through the imitation of our oppressors. Sort of reminds me of that movie, Imitation of Life. Assuming that the oppressor represents life. And of course, one of the things that we must recognize is that our oppressor represents death. That our oppressor is deadly. One of the things that impressed me most when I went to graduate school and really had my first real contact with the white education establishment. And one day I was leaving the university and I kept repeating to myself, these people are dead. You know? they're dead. There's death around them somewhere. And which is the reason why they are deadly as a people. And the reason why every advancement in knowledge for them is an advancement in the knowledge of destruction. And every advancement in knowledge is an advancement in the ability to kill and destroy the earth, and to kill and destroy nature, and to kill and destroy others, and to rape and rob the earth of its wealth and of its people and of its life forms. So deadly until now they are having great difficulty even reproducing themselves. At the very center of their lives is death and destruction. We cannot imitate a people who are our oppressors, and we have this kind of silliness that goes on in the system today. You're going to complain on one hand about these racist people, about how they enslaved us, but how they exploited us, how they discriminate against us, and how they do this and how they do that, and then turn right around and see their behavior as something to be emulated, and to see their behavior as something to be imitated. Ladies and gentlemen, if you imitate your oppressor, if you identify with your oppressor, then since your oppressor treats us with disdain and degradation, and treats us with destructive impulses and desires, then will not the imitation of this oppressor mean that we will engage also in self-destruction and in self-degradation? If we behave the way our oppressor behaved, then won't we also engage in self-oppression? If we think the way our oppressor thinks, then won't we think about ourselves the way the oppressor thinks about us? If we talk the way our oppressor talks, then won't we curse ourselves the way the oppressor curses us? And when we ride these subways day in and day out, and we look at the behavior of our peoples in these communities, we can see a people imitating their oppressor. And in imitating their oppressors, they perform the work of the oppressor in terms of self-destruction and self-abnegation. Imitation of the oppressor then is equivalent to the treatment of the self and one's fellows as the oppressor would treat us. It is equal to the treatment of the self and the group in a destructive manner. It equals the lack of self-respect and respect for the group, since the oppressor lacks respect for us as individuals and as a group. If our oppressors exploit us, then the imitation of our oppressor means self-exploitation. So consequently, you see in the legacy of Marcus Garvey a moving away from the imitation of our oppressors and a moving toward the identification with all that is African. Marcus Garvey, of course, recognized as well that we must, as people, love one another. And as all great teachers have taught, love is the foundation for any group's cohesiveness and unity of purpose. Love is the greatest inhibitor of aggression and internal conflict. It is the means by which the group cares and shares for itself and shares its resources. It is the means by which the group harnesses its resources, and defends itself against the incursions of its enemies. We have a philosophy here today, ladies and gentlemen, that only permits love to take place often in terms of people outside of ourselves, in terms of people external to ourselves. At the center of the integrationist movement is this conscious and unconscious ideology that if we can get our enemies to love us, then we can get around to loving ourselves. But as I pointed out earlier, if the enemy's status, economic, social, and otherwise, relies on his cultivation and maintaining of a hatred toward us, then that enemy will never get around to loving us. And if we depend then upon our enemy loving us before we love ourselves, then we will never get around to loving ourselves. So consequently, we must forget about getting the enemy to love us and getting our oppressors to love us and so-called respect us. We must go directly and speak directly to our hearts and to our minds and love ourselves and love one another, because it is through that love that we advance our interest. When we look at the legacy of Marcus Garvey, we see again an emphasis on productivity. Marcus Garvey did not have to read Engels, Marx, and Lenin, even though she was familiar with them. He did not have to read those to recognize the intimate relationship between the means of production and the character of a people, to recognize the intimate relationship between the nature of the economic relationships of people and their social relationships one with the other. It was apparent in his observing of our people across the world. He recognized, as we must recognize, that social character to a significant extent is determined by the nature of social relations and of labor relations. He recognized ultimately that the eating at lunch counters with our enemies, the sharing of hotels and beds with those enemies, the marrying and sleeping with their daughters would not advance our interests ultimately as a people. That consuming their products would not ultimately rescue us from subordination. Ultimately, freedom and independence is founded on production, upon the creation of employment, upon the creation of labor, and the creation of products for our own consumption. When we look in the world today, we will see that the powerful nations and the powerful people are producing people, not consuming people. As I've often said, you cannot consume yourself into equality. You cannot consume yourself into power. Those nations who depend upon consumption will see that as they consume the products of others and do not produce themselves, they will be consumed by others. We see that now happening right here in the so-called United States of America. We hear the people now in Congress and other places bellyaching about how the Japanese closed out their markets and how we cannot sell in the Japanese markets, but how the Japanese invade this market. The economists now know that this country is living on borrowed time, that it is spending beyond its means, that its so-called Reagan prosperity is a bogus prosperity that is dependent upon the input of foreign nations, that Japan, to a good extent, along with a couple of other nations, is financing the consumption habits of the United States. And at some point, we are going to have to face a moment of truth. And we, as African people, must recognize that we are going to be caught in the very jaws of this moment. Because this kind of economic relationship cannot continue forever. We've seen evidence of it this week where tariffs were imposed or shall be imposed upon Japanese products. We have seen a wholesale stripping of the United States of its industrial base. The Midwest is now called the Rust Belt because industries have literally flown outside of the country and the nation. I was looking the other evening at the so-called decrease in unemployment. And yet when you look at that decrease in unemployment, you see it in the so-called service areas. You see the so-called increase of jobs in the areas of the McDonald's and the Bojangles, but not in the areas of manufacture. As a matter of fact, there is a continuing decline in the area of manufacture in this country. So we have a superficial ideology that's built around service and service industries, but not around productivity. And now this white man is recognizing that in this nation, he has got to do something about it, or else he will fade. And we as a people must recognize as well that we cannot move forward based on consumption. We must produce and outproduce our enemies. That is our ultimate salvation. No other thing will do. And that was a legacy that Marcus Garvey left us, and left us very strongly, that we must engage in productive labor, productive growth and development if we were to, and if we are to survive. Looking at these few statements in regard to the legacy of Marcus Garvey, there must be in some of your minds the question then, did it succeed? Or why are we in the state that we are in today? And I must frankly say I am somewhat disturbed by the fact that to a degree, even though certainly the spirit of Marcus Garvey lives in the hearts of many of us, it has not manifested itself as much as it should have and as much as it can. As a matter of fact, when we look at our situation today, we see an actual decline in black economic development, not only in this country, but in the world in general. And we have been witnessing in the last few years, even in this country, a backward slide in our economic and political development. What happened in terms of the legacy of Marcus Garvey? Certainly there can be many reasons for that now. Just look at a couple. One of them, of course, I believe, was and is the ascendancy of the assimilationist, the integrationist. Those leaders who came and tried to project an unreal hope that we could advance the interests of our people by identifying with the destinies of our enemies. A people who try to get us to forget our color and to forget our African heritage. A suppression of those of us who try to maintain our African identity and our African destiny. When you couple that kind of leadership with a few concessions by the establishment, with a type of prosperity, economic prosperity, that made an appearance in the 50s and maintained itself through the 60s, you had a combination then that worked against the interests of the nationalist organizations and the nationalist ideology. We saw a national and neo-colonialist leadership that fell for the delusions of the so-called establishment in the system. and has misled the people into thinking then that their ultimate salvation is that of identifying and becoming one with their oppressors. It is the result of a leadership that has tried to get us to accept the reality of our the thing I have to deal with daily in my classrooms is the amount of lying that must take place in the name of education. The amount of outright deception that goes by the name of education. How truth must be nailed to the cross in classroom after classroom. How people tremble and quake and suffer from anxiety when truth and reality is brought up by their teachers. How people are pushed out of the universities and punished because they dare talk about truth. How people think that they should go to school only to be made comfortable. I have to warn my students time and time again that when you enter my classes, you are not going to be comfortable. I'm here to raise your level of anxiety and your level of fear. I am here to make you suffer. Because if you're in any class, particularly a social science class, and you're comfortable, chances are you're being lied to. Because it is in these classes that you must attain a confrontation with yourself and with reality. And you must attain a confrontation with the lying world that has created you in terms of who and what you are now. You must confront the nature of this beast called education, of which you are a part, and how it is going to transform you into a beast. And how you then must be conscious, become conscious of what it is doing to you and against you, so that you may escape its destiny that it has planned for you. And each day then I sit in the class, mixed, Asians, whites, and blacks, Hispanics, and sometimes it's an exercise in twisting and turning and, and squirming, because I dare talk about slavery, because I dare talk about colonialism, because I dare talk about the sickness of Europeans, because I dare talk about the lying, deceptive, and devilish nature and the pathology of the people who now rule this world. And because I dare talk about the irony of where two white men sit down and determine the destiny of a world that's over 90% colored. And where I dare tell them that they sit in these classes and they let these whites and their education brainwash them and propagandize them into servitude, and how their education is an education into ignorance. But if we are to rescue our children and our students and our people, then these unpleasant issues must be dealt with forthrightly. When we deal with then an assimilationist leadership that sees the solution to our problem as getting our children more soundly educated in these lies, then you are going to see a decline and destruction of African people, who thinks that their salvation is one of being educated by the very people who've destroyed them in the first place. You have a paradox there. Why is it that the arbiter of truth, the validator of truth, are the very people who've lied to us most? You know, I often have to remind my students and my audiences that if I say something, you have a hard time believing it, and it's strange. A white man comes in and saying you believe it right away. You have to be conditioned to accept accept truth and see truth as coming out the mouth of these liars. But that is a part of the thing that I will be talking about here in my next series of lectures. How is it that you make a people backwards, such that the first people they believe are the people who've lied to them most? That the first validators of truth are the people who have manipulated their very lives through lies and deception. I've indicated time and time again how you cannot have this 10% of the world's population ruling over the other 90% unless that 10% keeps the 90% out of its mind. It can only achieve its dominance over the other 90% through deception. The very essence of the identity of Satan, the devil, is that he is a deceiver. The very source of his power, the very foundation of his bringing mankind down and destroying of mankind was through the lie and through deception. And we must recognize then that the white man's rule depends upon ongoing deception and lies. And ultimately then we cannot see him as the foundation and the basis of truth. And ultimately then we cannot let him be the educator of our children. And ultimately we cannot let the reality that he projects become our reality. For he is sick of mind and sick of heart. He is deceived by his own lies. And therefore the reality he projects must be a lying reality. He suffers and he is deadly. How can we not suffer and die if we accept what he sees as real and unreal? And those leaders then who seek to tell us that we can only rescue ourselves through accepting the identity of the white man and to accepting the so-called reality of the white man are leaders who will lead us only to our peril and to our death. And we must recognize that if we were to live, we have to remove these kinds of leaders. And one of the reasons for the condition that we are in today then is that of a leadership that has not yet decided that it will determine a new reality and develop an Afrocentric reality, one that is suitable to the advancement and development of black people. We have a leadership that has thrown away and rejected self-knowing to a knowing of the enemy. We have people who have a pride in the fact that they know more about the enemy, about the history of their enemies, than they know about themselves, who have a pride in getting degrees in the history of their enemies and knowing nothing about who and what they are as a people. We have a leadership then that made us think that knowledge of self was not important, that knowledge only of our oppressors was the only important knowledge, and that knowledge of who and what he was and about is the only knowledge of importance. And therefore, the more knowledge and the more education these leaders gained in the Eurocentric sense, and the more knowledge and education they gained in terms of the knowledge of the oppressor, the more ignorant they became of themselves. And a people who are ignorant of themselves are a people, too, who are headed for disaster. We have a leadership that sought to get us to accept the status quo or the control of the world by the European. You hear some of us saying, well, it's the white man's world, so we may as well learn how to live in it or get along with it. The assimilationist often accepts, consciously and unconsciously, the idea that the white man will continue to rule the world. And he bases then his ideology and political action on this concept. That somehow our destiny is not to overthrow the white man. Our destiny is not to remove this pathological person. Our destiny is not to suppress and bring these sick people under control, but to heal them in some sort of way, to convert them, to become a part of them. Our destiny is not to see that the very system and the very ideology upon which these oppressors move is one of sickness and insanity, and therefore is in need of replacement by an Afrocentric ideology and a healthy ideology that comes out of our own self-knowing, but a leadership that wants us to accept this sickness as normality and to follow these pathological beings into self-destruction. And consequently, then, you will see the enemy's children, the enemy's personality as held up as normal, as representing the norm, and our behavior to the degree that it differs from that of our enemies as being seen as deviant and as abnormal, to the degree where we confuse equality and sameness, where we think in order to be equal or greater than our enemies, we have to be the same as our enemies, to the degree that we thought that differentness represents automatically inferiority. And therefore we become alarmed at anything that says we are somehow different from our enemy. And we must recognize, ladies and gentlemen, that racism is a sickness, that the exploitation and the wholesale rape and pillaging of the earth by the European represents a pathology and an illness. And therefore, our destiny is not one of trying to become a member of this gang of thieves, but to end this existence here on this earth, to inhibit its rapacious ways, and to bring this group of people to heal. And yet we've had a leadership that makes us think that our only crime has been that we've been left out on the booty of these thieves. And we get a leadership that cries about how we're only getting a certain percentage of their robbery and a certain percentage of their thievery. You must recognize, ladies and gentlemen, it's not about getting a piece of the stolen gains of these people, but it's to stop their thievery and rape of the world, period, and as a whole. So it is not about being left out of the mainstream, ladies and gentlemen. It is about bringing into being a new world order. We had a leadership, as I implied in our first statement, and I'm still talking about how we moved away from this Garveyism, that in its ascendance could not love itself except that it was loved by whites. To a good extent, the assimilationist ideology was one as represented in their Supreme Court struggles that said that black children could not love themselves until they were loved by white children. That the self-hatred that was found in black people was a result of the fact that their masters did not love them. That the lack of self-respect was a result that we were not respected by our oppressors. And therefore, we put our children into school with them very early in life, that they might then get a chance to see that we are really human, that we were just like they, and that then they could come and accept us as they accept themselves. And if they come to accept us, if they accept themselves, then we would come to accept ourselves. A very curious kind of ideology and psychology that lays the basis of self-acceptance on the acceptance of our enemies. And therefore we've been waiting for these last 100 or 200 years for our enemies to love us, for our enemies to accept us, so that we can get around to accepting ourselves. But often I ask the question, what if they never get around to accepting us? What if they never get around to loving us? A people whose love is based upon external sources and who must get around themselves through the love of external people are a people then who are under the control of those external forces and external people. A people who have no will and destiny of their own. A people who ultimately then are reactionary in nature, whose major concern is the attitude of their enemy, who are obsessed, who are compelled to look at their enemy and study their enemy day and night, who make a scholarship of looking at the every move of their enemy and reading the every scintilla of body language of their enemy as a way of determining their own behavior, and therefore never get around to themselves and knowing themselves and accepting and loving themselves. And we've had that kind of leadership. Looking at a minuscule population in the world, a 10% population in the world, as a cue as to how they themselves shall behave. It is a case then of the tail wagging the dog, where the small group of people wags the rest of the world, because the dog is obsessed with trying to catch up with his tail. This leadership then has robbed us of the Marcus Garvey legacy. We have a leadership then that has sold us conspicuous consumption as a way of salvaging our egos, that makes us think that we will be equal to the white man when we can drive the same cars and have the same jobs, when we can sleep in the same beds and buy in the same neighborhoods. A consumer equality. Not an equality of ownership, not a real equality based on wealth. You got a leadership that talks to us about equality of income. And as I've often pointed out before, there is a difference between income and wealth. We will not be equal to the white man when we have an equal income, ladies and gentlemen. Because you see, you can get an income from a salary, but you can also get an income from the ownership of resources. A man can have $1 million worth of land and get an income of $10,000. And a man can get an income of $10,000 working for someone else. And even though you say they have an equal income, they are not equally wealthy. And so you have a leadership then that has sold us on income equality, but not wealth. That means that that's a leadership that's going to look at income instead of the control of African property, instead of the ownership of African property and the ownership of African wealth. A leadership that looks at the amount of consumption as a gauge of its equality, looks at the degree to which it can consume as much as its master as a basis of equality, and not the degree to which it owns its means of productions and has control over its own inherited wealth. And we've had that kind of leadership, and thus we've seen then African people the world over, in this country and on the continent, give up the very basic wealth of their lands, their own lands, and their very basic real estate to their enemies for a few pennies and for materials that fade away and are corrupt and corruptible. We have a leadership then that is not concerned with developing its own productive capacities, but merely with getting a job and being identified with the productive capacities of others, with literally marrying the enemy and thus trying to achieve the status of the enemy through marriage instead of through strength and power. We have seen then this assimilationist leadership which came to the fore and has pushed back to a degree the nationalist leadership, reigned over then the decline of African peoples the world over. the decline in African education, the destruction of the African family, the retardation of African technology, the decline and retardation of African economics, the rampaging of our community by drugs, the colonial occupation of our community by foreign police forces and others who are not members of the African community. When we look then over the past 20, 30, and 40 years, we've seen an assimilationist leadership that has brought us to the terrible moral and economic, social, political, and educational impasse which we are complaining about today, that has made us now face the Howard Beaches and the other kinds of disasters that are occurring daily, that are making us see then racism rear its ugly head in a very direct way on the campuses of Columbia University, the campuses of Massachusetts, the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, Michigan, the so-called bastions of white liberalism. We must recognize, ladies and gentlemen, then, that we cannot put our faith in the goodwill of our enemies. We can only put our faith in our own strength and power. And a leadership then that depends upon converting the white man is a leadership that is placing us in a very perilous situation, and is a leadership that ultimately is placing us in a position to be destroyed. While we may look at the assimilationist leadership, we as black nationalists, as those who carry on the legacy of Marcus Garvey, must also look at ourselves. While we may gloat to a degree in the failures of the assimilationist leadership and show them the squalid outcome of their leadership, how they fought for equal housing, and how now a major problem is homelessness, how they fought for integrated schools, and how our major problem is dropoutism, how our major problem is illiteracy, how they threw their bodies before tractors and threw their bodies before traffic to get us into the colleges and universities, and we find again our major problem now is the decline of black students on the university level, the decline of black teachers on college campuses, the decline of black teachers in the schools, period, and the decline of the education of black people as a whole. How they struggle to get a justice on the Supreme Court, and how we face injustice every day in the courts of New York City and the world over. How they struggle to get us to have window dressing jobs, and how our children and people are unemployed in the streets of our cities, and how we are facing the possibility that we may have a 70% or more unemployment among black males in the future. How then we recognize that their faith in the so-called law, a law which is only as good as the people who enforce it, how their faith in redeeming the white man from his pathological racism has shown that this faith is hopeless. We may gloat at that, but we almost also must accept our responsibility too in the decline to a degree of our ability to carry out the Marcus Garvey legacy. And how has that occurred? To a degree with the rise of assimilationist leadership, I think we also had a simultaneous rise of pseudo-nationalistic leadership. A nationalist rhetoric without a nationalist substance. A people who talk good nationalism, but who do not behave and actualize what that nationalism means. We are now engaged in a struggle between true nationalism and counterfeit nationalism. It is time for us to remove then those counterfeit nationalists who are also, in a certain subtle sort of way, the partners of the assimilationists. Let's look again at the nationalist who is true to his cause. And let us test our nationalists by some of these criteria that I shall mention here. The true nationalist is not obsessed with the past to the exclusion of the present. We have some nationalists whose heads are on backwards, and they can only look into the distant past. And they look so far, they look so far in the past, and they're so concerned with the past until they stumble over the present and cannot see what is coming in the future. They grovel and revel in the great glories of the past to the absence of the future. One of the things I think you will see in the Marcus Garvey legacy is while he raised the black man's past to great heights, and while he projected that past, and while he made that past a part of the consciousness of black people, there was a thoroughgoing concern with the present and with the future. There was a thoroughgoing concern with the construction of now and the construction of the future. There was not merely then an ongoing and exclusive and compulsive concern with things that were, and not with things as they are and things as they can and shall be. The true nationalist is forward-looking and futuristic. I see too few conferences, few people concerned about the future, even nationalists. What is going to occur in the year 2000? What will be the condition of the people in the year 2050, 2100? What must we do today to secure the survival and the advancement of African people the world over? What must we do to fight off the threat of the Asian takeover of the world? We're not only confronted with the white man today, ladies and gentlemen, we also confronted with other people in the world today. We are confronted then with a rise of Asian civilization as well. Are we to throw off, or are we to see the death of European civilization only to fall under the yoke of Asian civilization? We can look out in our streets today and see it coming. It is around us everywhere. The invasion of our communities by the Asian units is a sign of times to come. And the African man is at the crossroads today. For African people then must not only evoke their great past, but now they must evoke their future as well and create that future. The true nationalist then does not escape and hide through glorification of the past what must be done in the present and what must be done in the future. The bogus nationalist, he raises up the people and builds up a false pride in the people in terms of past history, but he leaves them groping as to what must be done now, and leaves them feeling high and mighty when they walk out of the halls and oratory with his out of the halls and out of the churches with his oratory ringing in their ears, only to face the Korean stores once they get outside, only to face their communities taken over by Arabs, by Hispanics, and by other groups. And with that ringing oratory and rhetoric, they must face the reality that while the knowledge of history is wonderful and is great and it is a necessary part of our resurrection of people, it is not going to be our sole basis of salvation. We must not only concern ourselves with our past, we must concern ourselves with now, and we must use now to create our future. The true nationalist is intrepid. Not that the nationalist does not have fear, but he learns to operate in spite of fear. Fear does not paralyze him. He uses the fear as an energy to move forward and to confront his enemies. He does not hide his fear behind high-sounding phrases and high-sounding scholarship in dredging up the past. He dredges up the past as a means of integrating it into his personality and as a foundation for his movement forward and his thrust into the future. He does not then put forth a kind of pseudo game that I see many of our nationalist people putting forth here. A people who sort of participate with the establishment, who sort of arouse the revolutionary fervor of their audiences, but when you stop and think about it, have left you with no real tools and techniques for dealing with our current problems, who do not project the future and what it will be like. The true nationalist is entrepreneurial. He's building something. He's constructing something, and we see that in Garvey. Not just a concern with the past, not just an identification with Egypt, not just an identification with the great African empires of the past, not just picking up little detail upon little detail of some African past, but of a sound movement forward in concrete brick and mortar construction, a sound hands-on development and actualization of African ideology and of African political ideology and political development. He is one who then thrusts his fear aside and moves forward. The true nationalist not only respects his ethnic heritage and the glories of his ancestors, but is equally, if not more, concerned with the inheritance that he's going to pass on to his children, with the legacy that he's going to give to his children. We have people who go, scrape their monies together, give it to Pan Am, give it to the Arabs, jump out the plane, bow and scrape and kiss the earth, just to salve their own wounded ego. But when you come and say, give that $1,500 to the feeding of your children, to the educating of your children, to the creation of jobs for your people, to the gaining of control over real estate and gain of control over your wealth, somehow they're not able to make those sacrifices. They're willing to worship the pyramids of 2,000 and 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, but will not build pyramids in the present so that their children may see what they left behind as well. We have then a people who then get caught up and make the people look at the past glories but leave their own children neglected, who will give great analytical and oratorical dissertations on the inadequacies of Eurocentric education, and yet will not contribute one penny of their monies and their times to the construction of their own schools, who year after year will spend millions and give it away to the others, but will not give it to their young. That is pseudo-nationalism, ladies and gentlemen. We see the true nationalist in the guise and in the person of Marcus Garvey, in the person of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who not only complains about the nature of the education of black children, but who does something about it, who builds the schools and builds the universities, who constructs and instructs as a part of his nationalist mission. As the Bible says, you can tell a tree by the fruit it bears. Look not only then at the words, at the scholarship, at the dredging up of the past, but look at the fruits of the labors of your leaders. See what real and concrete comes from their words. The true nationalist is not obsessed about the destruction of his civilizations, about the cruelty of his fate and about the devilishness of his enemies. Certainly he analyzes those. He looks at it. Certainly he laments the destruction of black civilization and the falls of our empires and the falls of our kingdoms and our fall from grace to a degree. But he does not become traumatized by those falls and by those disruptions. He does not become obsessed and compulsive about their analysis. He looks at them, he learns from them, he integrates them into his personality, into his ideology. He swears never again, and he moves forward. And he uses that knowledge to construct a new civilization. He looks at the mistakes of his ancestors. He looks at the mistakes of his past civilizations, and he puts those mistakes and integrates those mistakes into his personality. And he then moves forward to build new civilizations and new worlds and to found new empires, and not just to lament the ones past and gone. He does not exclusively study his past, but seeks to study and determine the future. He opens himself up to all kinds of knowledge and information as a way of getting to know reality. He does not spend too much time in sputtering and impotent rage against his oppressors, rage that does not advance his interest, but he works calmly and steadfastly to bring into being a new order. He does not indulge in ancient and esoteric ceremonies merely to salvage his wounded ego and his wounded pride, and merely to divert his interest and to spend his time. He does not get carried away in moons and numbers and all of that as a way of guiding his life. He recognizes that while he may be into the phases of moons and the movements of planets, that the real world moves by the operation of hands, brick and mortar being stacked one upon top of the other. While he recognizes the greatness of Osiris and Isis and all of the rest, he recognizes that ultimately the pyramids were built by the hands of men. That no God, I have yet to see a God build a temple. I see men building temples. I see men building cities. I see men and people digging the mines. I see people doing the jobs. And so ultimately, while we may get into the spirit gods and so forth, and it is great that we evoke those gods and look at those religions and get into the ideologies and get into the astrologies and get into the esoterica, ultimately, though, we must come back down to earth and deal with the real things that are happening right here. We may use, there is nothing wrong with using the astrologies and using the esoteric religions and using the moons and planets as guides for our behavior. But let us not become obsessed with them to such a degree that we do nothing else. In fact, in my daily life, I tell you, the most retarded people I see in terms of economic, social, political, personal development are the ones who know the most about the moon, the most about the planets, the most about the numbers and you. And often I have to remind them sometimes, when are you going to use some of this stuff for your own self-advancement? How is it then that you can give all of this great and wonderful advice to everyone else, but you cannot use it for yourself? Why not demonstrate the effectiveness of what you're talking about in your own behavior and in your own life, and therefore be a light and a beacon to other people, and demonstrate through your life behavior and your life habits the effectiveness of your ideology and of your religions and of your concepts. And so therefore I'm not saying don't believe in it, but let it work for you. I remember, I think it was Farrakhan or someone who said a long time ago that in a sense, what is it, the oppressed man, in one way, one man In one instance, his religion works for him. His religion serves him. And for the man that's down and out, he does what? He serves his religion. And we have to make a difference. We have to look and differentiate between a religion and an ideology and an esoteric ceremony that works and serves who? Us. And one that requires our future, but yet does not advance our interests and does not change our political, social situation. And we got a lot of people out here then who are serving ceremonies and who are serving ideologies, but whose ceremonies and ideologies are not doing a service for them. And we can differentiate between the pseudo-nationalist and the true one in the sense of, is his religion, is his ideology, is his philosophy serving him, or is he merely serving them? We must recognize, while it is fine to worship the ancients, and while it is fine to praise and respect our ancestors, we must not become so obsessively worshipful and so obsessed about their respect that we refuse to see about our own children, that we refuse to become great ancestors in our own right, that we refuse to take care of our future. One of the things that you can look at if you want to look at Asian civilization and look at the movement of the Asian today, if you study a bit of Asian culture, you will recognize that at the center of Asian culture is so-called ancestor worship, is great respect toward the ancestors. At the very center is a large and huge and long history built around tradition. But one of the things that puzzles Western man and puzzles the European as he looks at the Asian is, how is it that the Asian, though he respects highly his ancestor, and though he engages in ancestor worship, and though he is exceedingly traditional, he is at the same time technologically his equal and technologically in advance of the European. And he shows then very clearly that one can still respect and love and worship the ancestors, and yet one can still be very much into the world of today, and one can still very much move in advance technologically and otherwise of his or her enemies. That the worship of ancestors, that the respect for ancestors, that the respect for tradition does not imply then that we cannot concern ourselves with the immediate and with the future. And the correct worship of ancestors and the correct praise of tradition is the foundation for an advancement in the future. The pseudo-nationalist engages his people in the obsessive worship of ancestors and the obsessive praise of ancestors to the destruction of his future concerns and of his children. The true nationalist not only educates the wounded egos of adults, but educates his young. We see many of our nationalist organizations concern themselves weekend after weekend with the education of grown people. And that's fine. That is a part of the education of the race and the advancement of the race. But we must recognize that we have to educate our young as well, and that the true survival of the race must couple the education of the parents with the education of the children. And nationalist organizations that concern themselves almost exclusively with the education of the adult and not the education of children, this is nationalism that is incomplete. That is why you see in Marcus Garvey, you see in Elijah Muhammad, an equal education of the adult and of the children, an education of the family as a whole, and an education of individuals as well. Because a true nationalist knows that he must educate, as the word nationalism implies, what? The nation and everyone in it. When you see a nationalist organization only educating its adults, you may get a clue that you have an organization that may not be so concerned with the educating of people, but a people who are dealing in a compensatory way with their hurt pride. People who are more concerned with salvaging their own ego pains than with really advancing the interests of their people. Because it is these people then who will spend tons of money upon the salvaging of their own ego and yet rob their children of a sound education and sound development. And therefore the true nationalist sees the education of all as his destiny. The true nationalist recognizes the unity of the relationship between education and building, politics, economics, and religion. He is not just a specialist, but you'll see in the organization of Marcus Garvey, the organization of Elijah Muhammad, not just an organization that is centered around some special concern, just concerned, let us say, with jobs, or just concerned with the legal aspects of black people, or just concerned with education of black people, but an organization that is concerned with all aspects of that have to do with the advancement of black people. As I've often said, in the organization of Marcus Garvey, Elijah Muhammad, you see the advancement of a culture, not just of a political ideology, but of a full culture that concerned itself with reconstruction of the family, with the education of his children, with the development of an economic system, with ultimately the development of a nation and the development of a people. And therefore the true nationalist then sees a unity and a relationship between things and recognizes then that all aspects that are important to the advancement of our people must be developed and spoken to and related one to the other. And that there's a unity between then economic development, social development, and psychological development. You just cannot psychologically transform a people through lectures alone, through the teaching of history alone. Those people must be concretely engaged in the gaining of their own freedom, in the construction of their own independence, in the building of their own fate. In fact, the best psychotherapy of all is the psychotherapy of constructing one's own civilization and in constructing one's own nation. The true nationalist recognizes that the necessity of building a national government and a national and an international government as well. That we ultimately must build in this country and the world over a nation and nations of African people. The true nationalist is not afraid to delegate power. You see, we have a lot of people who come into nationalism who bring in their egotistical problems with them. And we have a lot of people who think because a person spouts a nationalist ideology that they've overcome selfishness and greed and self-centeredness and pettiness and overcome ignorance and overcome fear. Not hardly, ladies and gentlemen. Not likely. Because those things still must grow and develop. I often warn people, do not fall for people merely because they project a nationalist ideology. You must look into their soul. You must look at their character and see what the character really has in it. Because it is that that determines your relationship with them and not just the statements of their ideology. Ultimately, if we are to control our destiny, as Marcus Garvey indicated, we must then control ourselves and we must then become self-governing. And a nationalism that is not talking about self-government, that is not talking about nation building, that is not constructing a national network, that is not constructing a national economic system, social and political system, is a false nationalism, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore, we've had a leadership often that while it has inspired us with this knowledge of history and knowledge of the past, and inspired us with this daring to curse the white man out, has left us bereft of a nation, and bereft of a government, and bereft of a structure. The means and the only means by which ultimately we can defend ourselves against our enemies and determine our destiny. Be not then deceived by words. We must then look at deed. It not only motivates, the true nationalist not only motivates through language and through rhetoric and through oratory, but trains. You cannot train the people with a 2-hour lecture on Saturdays, ladies and gentlemen. You cannot train people with once a month, once a week meetings. You know how to get people talk about, they ask me, why do we do this? Why can't we just do so and so and so? You know, and they throw their hands up in exasperation. Why do we behave in this way or that way? Can't we see? You know, you get this kind of thing here that goes on. Then you get the question, what must we do in order to do so and so and so and so? And of course, often that question is asked with the expectation that some kind of magical formula is going to be handed out. You know, just say abracadabra and things will change, you know. Make a few passes across your heart and, you know, do that and this. It's going to change. It's not that way. You do what every other people have done. What do you think these schools are for out here, ladies and gentlemen? What do you think the colleges are here for? What do you think the various institutes are here for? They're here to train people to behave the way they are expected to behave. You don't leave it to happenstance and circumstance for your people to behave the way they should behave. You train them to behave the way they should behave. That is why you build schools. The European, the Japanese do not ask why don't their children behave this way. They train them to behave this way. They inculcate them, and they send them to school when? Once a week? 2 hours on Saturday? Every day. Throughout the summer. Every evening. That's what school is about. They spend more time with their teachers and with their trainers often than with their parents. This is what you do. If you want your people to behave correctly economically, then you have to educate them economically. If you want them to behave in a family sort of way correctly, then they have to be educated to be familiar. If you want them to behave correctly in terms of self-respect toward one another, then they have to be trained to behave with respect toward one another. This is not something that comes up by accident. And institutions have to be developed and built so that this training can take place. And the greater part of their time and the time and effort of our children should be dedicated to being trained to acquire the behaviors that we need to advance our interests. But you're not going to get that behavior if you depend upon that behavior being trained into your children by your enemies, by people who need to have ill behavior and maladjusted behavior to maintain their power position in life. You cannot advance the interests of your people merely by talking about our greatness for a couple of hours in the afternoon. You're going to have to teach it day in and day out and place your students and your people in a position so that they may learn how to behave and how to resolve their problems. The intelligence is something, though it is given, has to be shaped. The true nationalist leader sees to the welfare of his people. One of the things when you study the history of the Japanese and Chinese and other groups in this country, you study the history of the people who, particularly the Japanese and Chinese, saw to it that the welfare of their people were not in the hands of other people. And when you read in the past when the Chinese and the Japanese were suffering greatly from economic oppression, how they still did not let their people go on welfare through the general system. They built their own welfare programs and their own internal caring programs because they recognized that when people must beggar their enemy and when they must be supported by their enemies, then they're going to be directed by their enemies, and their destiny is going to be determined by their enemies. And so consequently, if you have a nationalist leader that is not moving and designing such that the people can care for themselves and their own interests, then you're dealing with a pseudo-nationalist, not a true nationalist. And you see then in Marcus Garvey, again, a man who is building with his organization a means by which the welfare of African people could be the basis and the concern and be founded upon the work and activity of African people, not upon other people who have stolen our wealth in the first place, and now we have to beg them for a little bit of it in the second. The true African leader then rewards his people, and the approval of his people is the greatest approval he can gain. We still have people who gain their greatest sense of self through the degrees and through the so-called minor rewards given them by their enemies. And we often honor our own people to the degree that they have been given these symbols of authority by another people. We have to recognize that the true nationalist becomes the source of his own rewards and becomes the source of the approval of his own people, and it is ultimately the rewards by our own and the approval of our own that is the final and the ultimate reward that we go for, because it is through getting rewarded and approved in this way that we advance the interests of our people. The true nationalist grounds his political and social philosophy and practice on a realistic analysis of his situation and of his enemies. He is not a slavish reader of foreign sources and of other political ideologies. He does not permit his reading of Marx and Lenin and these other people to paralyze his ability to think creatively. And he must recognize that the ultimate foundation for his political activity and behavior is his own realistic analysis for himself of his situation and of his circumstances, and that his ultimate political decisions, social, economic, and otherwise, must be grounded on that knowledge, not upon a theoretical knowledge of people who belong to the enemy. Does it mean that he does not read the other people? Certainly he can read the other people. But his ultimate decision is based upon his own analysis and upon the sound knowledge of himself and who and what he is, and upon his reality. The true nationalist is not a purist to the degree that he is paralyzed. You know, we have some of us, we want to be nationalists, but we also want to be so pure until the end we don't do anything. You know? We end up paralyzed. We would go into business, but that's capitalism, isn't it? So we don't go into that. And we would do this, but that's in some way related to this ideology or to the enemy ideology or something. And so you see the individual often then trying to be such a pure nationalist until he cannot engage in real practical behavior. He is so concerned about getting his hand dirty, but that he dares not do anything at all. We can see the nationalist who is so hung up in his traumas, the traumas of nationalism, the traumas of capitalism, until he dare not engage in any economic development. He sees himself as been victimized by capitalistic greed, certainly by the European, until he becomes afraid of money. He sees himself used and exploited for economic ends until he does not determine exactly where money and wealth fits within his social ideological systems. And consequently then we get a nationalist who is hung up waiting for African communalism to come into being or communism to come into being, who's also frightened to engage in any kind of business because that's capitalism, so he remains frozen while the other ethnic groups move into his community and takes his economic resources and unemploys his children and uses his wealth against him. Therefore, the true nationalist recognizes that in this world, while we want to be as pure as possible and we strive for perfection. It means at times, though, we have to face reality for what it is and get out of it what we can and do the best with what we got. And not let ourselves be caught up then with a Puritanism that does nothing but set us up for destruction. The true nationalist then is not caught up in indecisiveness, and is not caught up in some pie-in-the-sky dream about classless societies, but gets engaged in the true work of building and construction. The true nationalist is not afraid also to overthrow tradition when tradition is unproductive. He's not one who just gives obeisance to African tradition out of some blind ignorance. And he's not one who says, even though I revere the African past and I revere the African tradition, but that tradition can be built upon. I and my generation have something to add to that tradition. I have a right then to use the legacy of that tradition to confront the realities of my current time, to modify that tradition to see to my survival and the survival of my people. And therefore, the true nationalist does not just manipulate and threaten with tradition, but uses tradition creatively and uses it knowing that as long as that tradition is used for the advancement of black people, then it is Afrocentric tradition. The true nationalist is not afraid then to engage in productive behavior. Where one sees then nationalism, one sees construction, actual growth and development. One sees building, one sees institutional development, one sees trade and development and commerce. One sees restructuring of values, restructuring of priorities. One sees the rebuilding of relationships. One sees the reallocation of resources. And when we then, as nationalist people, say that we are carrying out the legacy of Marcus Garvey, then let us show that legacy in concrete development, institution building, and nation building. Thank you very much.